Chapter 7. Memory. Psychologists class as representative mental processes those known as memory and imagination, respectively. The term representation is used in psychology to indicate the processes of representation or presenting again to consciousness that which has formerly been presented to it, but which afterwards passed from its field. As Hamilton says, the general capability of knowledge necessarily requires that, besides the power of evoking out of unconsciousness one portion of our retained knowledge, in preference to another, we possess the faculty of representing in consciousness what is thus evoked. Memory is the primary representative faculty or power of the mind. Imagination depends upon memory for its material, as we shall see when we consider that faculty. Every mental process which involves the remembrance, recollection, or representation of a sensation, perception, mental image, thought, or idea previously experienced must depend upon memory for its material. Memory is the great storehouse of the mind in which are placed the records of previous mental experiences. It is a part of the great subconscious field of mental activity, and the greater part of its work is performed below the plane of consciousness. It is only when its results are passed into the field of consciousness that we are aware of its existence. We know memory only by its works. Of its nature we know but little, although certain of its principal laws and principles have been discovered. It was formerly customary to class memory with the various faculties of the mind, but later psychology no longer so considers it. Memory is now regarded as a power of the general mind, manifesting in connection with every faculty of the mind. It is now regarded as belonging to the great subconscious field of mentation, and its explanation must be sought there. It is utterly unexplainable otherwise. The importance of memory cannot be overestimated. Not only does a man's character and education depend chiefly upon it, but his very mental being is bound up with it. If there were no memory, man would never progress mentally beyond the mental state of the newborn babe. He would never be able to profit by experience. He would never be able to form clear perceptions. He would never be able to reason or form judgments. The processes of thought depend for material upon the memory of past experiences. This material lacking, there can be no thought. Memory has two important general functions. Those are 1. The retention of impressions and experiences, and 2. The reproduction of the impressions and experiences so retained. It was formerly held that the memory retained only a portion of the impressions and experiences originally noted by it, but the present theory is that it retains every impression and experience which is noted by it. It is true that many of these impressions are never reproduced in consciousness, but experiments tend to prove, nevertheless, that the records are still in the memory and that appropriate and sufficiently strong stimuli will bring them into the field of consciousness. The phenomena of somnambulism, dreams, hysteria, delirium, approach of death, etc., show that the subconscious mind has an immense accumulation of apparently forgotten facts, which unusual stimuli will serve to recall. The power of the memory to reproduce the retained impressions and experiences is variously called remembrance, recollection, or memory. This power varies materially in various individuals, but it is an axiom of psychology that the memory of any person may be developed and trained by practice. The ability to recall depends to a great extent upon the clearness and depth of the original impression, which in turn depends upon the degree of attention given to it at the time of its occurrence. Recollection is also greatly aided by the law of association, or the principle whereby one mental fact is linked to another. The more facts to which a given fact is linked, the greater the ease by which it is recalled or remembered. Recollection is also greatly assisted by use and exercise. Like the fingers, the memory cells of the brain become expert and efficient by use and exercise, or stiff and inefficient by lack of the same. In addition to the phases of retention and reproduction, there are two important phases of memory, that is, 3. Recognition of the reproduced impression or experience, and 4. localization of the impression, or its reference to a more or less definite time and place. The recognition of the recalled impression is quite important. It is not enough that the impression be retained and recalled. If we are not able to recognize the recalled impression as having been experienced before, the recollection will be of but little use to us in our thought processes. The purposes of thought demand that we shall be able to identify the recalled impression with the original one. Recognition is really recognition, re-knowing. Recognition is akin to perception. The mind becomes conscious of the recalled impression just as it becomes conscious of the sensation. It then recognizes the relation of the recalled impression to the original one, just as it realizes the relation of the sensation to its object. The localization of the recalled and recognized impression is also important. Even if we recognize the recalled impression, it will be of comparatively little use to us unless we are able to locate it as having happened yesterday, last week, last month, last year, 10 years ago, or at some time in the past, and as having happened in our office, house, or in such and such a place in the street, or in some distant place. Without the power of localization, we should be unable to connect and associate the remembered fact with the time, place and persons with which it should be placed to be of use and value to us in our thought processes. Retention. The retention of a mental impression in the memory depends very materially upon the clearness and depth of the original impression, and this clearness and depth, as we have previously stated, depend upon the degree of attention bestowed upon the original impression. Attention, then, is the important factor in the forming and recording of impressions. The rule is slight attention, faint record; marked attention, clear and deep record. To fix this fact in the mind, the student may think of the retentive and reproductive phases of memory as a phonographic record. The receiving diaphragm of the phonograph represents the sense organs, and the recording needle represents the attention. The needle makes the record on the cylinder deep or faint according to the condition of the needle. A loud sound may be recorded but faintly if the needle is not properly adjusted, and further, it must be remembered that the strength of the reproduction depends almost entirely upon the clearness and depth of the original impression on the cylinder. As is the record, so is the reproduction. It will be well for the student to carry this symbol of the phonograph in his mind. It will aid him in developing his powers of memory. In this connection, we should remember that attention depends largely upon interest. Therefore, you would naturally expect to find that we remember interesting things far more readily than those which lack interest. This supposition is borne out in actual experience. This accounts for the fact that everyone remembers a certain class of things better than he does others. One remembers faces, another dates, another spoken conversation, another written words, and so on. It will be found, as a rule, that each person is interested in the class of things which he most easily remembers. The artist easily remembers faces and details of faces, or scenery and details thereof. The musician easily recalls passages or bars of music, often of a most complicated nature. The speculator easily recalls the quotations of his favourite stocks. The racing man recalls, without difficulty, the odds posted on a certain horse on a certain day, or the details of a race which was run many years ago. The moral is, arouse and induce an interest in the things which you wish to remember. This interest may be aroused by studying the things in question, as we have suggested in a preceding chapter. Visualization in memory. Many of the best authorities hold that original impressions may be made clear and deep, and the process of reproduction accordingly rendered more efficient by the practice of visualizing the thing to be remembered. By visualizing is meant the formation of a mental image of the thing in the imagination. If you wish to remember the appearance of anything, look at it closely, with attention, and then, turning away from it, endeavour to reproduce its appearance as a mental picture in the mind. If this is done, a particularly clear impression will be made in the memory, and when you recall the thing, you will find that you will also recall the clear mental image of it. Of course, the greater the number of details observed and included in the original mental image, the greater the remembered detail. Perception in memory. Not only is attention necessary in forming clear memory records, but careful perception is also important. Without clear perception, there is a lack of detail in the retained record, and the element of association is lacking. It is not enough to merely remember the thing itself. We should also remember what it is and all about it. The practice of the methods of developing perception, given in a preceding lesson, will tend to develop and train the retentive, reproductive, recognitive, and locative powers of the memory. The rule is, the greater the degree of perception accorded a thing, the greater the detail of the retained impression, and the greater the ease of the recollection. Understanding and memory. Another important point in acquiring impressions in memory is this, that the better the understanding of the subject or object, the clearer the impressions regarding it, and the clearer the recollection of it. This fact is proved by experiment and experience. A subject which will be remembered only with difficulty under ordinary circumstances will be easily remembered if it is fully explained to the person and accompanied by a few familiar illustrations or examples. It is very difficult to remember a meaningless string of words, while a sentence which conveys a clear meaning may be memorized easily. If we understand what a thing is for, its uses and employment, we remember it far more easily than if we lack this understanding. Elbringhaus, who conducted a number of experiments along this line, reports that he could memorize a stanza of poetry in about 1/10 the time required to memorize the same amount of nonsense syllables. Gordy states that he once asked a capable student of the Johns Hopkins University to give him an account of the lecture to which he had just listened. "I cannot do it," replied the student. "It was not logical." The rule is, the more one knows about a certain thing, the more easily is that thing remembered. This is a point worth noting. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Memory continued. The subject of memory cannot be touched upon intelligently without a consideration of the law of association, one of the important psychological principles. The law of association. What is known in psychology as the law of association is based on the fact that no idea exists in the mind except in association with other ideas. This is not generally recognized, and the majority of persons will dispute the law at first thought. But the existence and appearance of ideas in the mind are governed by a mental law as invariable and constant as the physical law of gravitation. Every idea has associations with other ideas. Ideas travel in groups, and one group is associated with another group, and so on, until, in the end, every idea in one's mind is associated directly or indirectly with every other idea. Theoretically, at least, it would be possible to begin with one idea in the mind of a person and then, gradually, unwind his entire stock of ideas like the yarn on the ball. Our thoughts proceed according to this law. We sit down in a brown study and proceed from one subject to another until we are unable to remember any connection between the first thought and the last. But each step of the reverie was connected with the one preceding and the one succeeding it. It is interesting to trace back these connections. Poe based one of his celebrated detective stories on this law. The reverie may be broken into by a sudden impression from outside, and we will then proceed from that impression, connecting it with something else already in our experience and starting a new chain of sequence. Often we fail to trace the associations governing our ideas, but the chain is there nevertheless. One may think of a past scene or experience without any apparent cause. A little thought will show that something seen, or a few notes of a song floating to the ears, or the fragrance of a flower, has supplied the connecting link between the past and the present. A suggestion of mignonette will recall some past event in which the perfume played a part. Someone's handkerchief, perhaps, carried the same odour. or an old familiar tune reminds one of someone, something, or some place in the past. A familiar feature in the countenance of a passer-by will start one thinking of someone else who had that kind of a mouth, that shaped nose, or that expression of the eye, and away he will be off in a sequence of remembered experiences. Often the starting idea, or the connecting links, may appear but dimly in consciousness, but rest assured they are always there. In fact, we frequently accept this law unconsciously and without realizing its actual existence. For instance, one makes a remark, and at once we wonder, how did he come to think of that? And if we are shrewd, we may discover what was in his mind before he spoke. There are two general classes of association of ideas in memory. Those are 1. Association of contiguity, and 2. Logical association. Association of contiguity is that form of association depending on the previous association in time or space of ideas which have been impressed on the mind. For instance, if you met Mr. and Mrs. Wetterhorn and were introduced to them one after the other, thereafter you will naturally remember Mr. W when you think of Mrs. W, and vice versa. You will naturally remember Napoleon when you think of Wellington, or Benedict Arnold when you think of Major Andre, for the same reason. You will also naturally remember B and C when you think of A. Likewise, you will think of abstract time when you think of abstract space, of thunder when you think of lightning, of colic when you recall green apples, of love-making and moonlit nights when you think of college days. In the same way, we remember things which occurred just before or just after the event in our mind at the moment, of things near in space to the thing of which we are thinking. Logical association depends upon the relation of likeness or difference between several things thought of. Things thus associated may have never come into the mind at the same previous time, nor are they necessarily connected in time and space. One may think of a book and then proceed, by association, to think of another book by the same author, or of another author treating of the same subject. Or he may think of a book directly opposed to the first, the relation of distinct difference causing the associated idea. Logical association depends upon inner relations, and not upon the outer relations of time and space. This innerness of relation between things not connected in space or time is discovered only by experience and education. The educated man realizes many points of relationship between things that are thought by the uneducated man to be totally unrelated. Wisdom and knowledge consist largely in the recognition of relations between things. Association in memory. It follows from a consideration of the law of association that when one wishes to impress a thing upon the memory, he should, as an authority says, multiply associations. Entangle the fact you wish to remember in a net of as many associations as possible, especially those that are logical. Hence the advice to place your facts in groups and classes in the memory. As Blackie says, nothing helps the mind so much as order and classification. Classes are always few, individuals many. To know the class well is to know what is most essential in the character of the individual, and what burdens the memory least to retain. Repetition in memory. Another important principle of memory is that the impressions acquire depth and clearness by repetition. Repeat a line of poetry once, and you may remember it. Repeat it again, and your chances of remembering it are greatly increased. Repeat it a sufficient number of times, and you cannot escape remembering it. The illustration of the phonograph record will help you to understand the reason of this. The rule is, constant repetition deepens memory impressions. Frequent reviewing and recalling what has been memorized tends to keep the records clear and clean, besides deepening the impression at each review. General rules of memory. The following general rules will be of service to the student who wishes to develop his memory. Making impressions. 1. Bestow attention. 2. Cultivate interest. 3. Manifest perception. 4. Cultivate understanding. 5. Form associations. 6. Repeat and review. Recalling impressions. 1. Endeavour to get hold of the loose end of association and then unwind your memory ball of yarn. 2. When you recall an impression, send it back with energy to deepen the impression and attach it to as many new associations as possible. 3. Practice a little memorizing and recalling each day, if only a line of verse. The memory improves by practice and deteriorates by neglect and disuse. 4. Demand good service of your memory, and it will learn to respond. Learn to trust it, and it will rise to the occasion. How can you expect your memory to give good service when you continually abuse it and tell everyone of the wretched memory I have? I can never remember anything. Your memory is very apt to accept your statements as truth. Our mental faculties have an annoying habit of taking us at our word in these matters. Tell your memory what you expect it to do, then trust it and refrain from abusing it and giving it a bad name. Final advice. Finally, remember this rule. You get out of your memory only that which you place in it. Place in it good, clear, deep impressions, and it will reproduce good, clear, strong recollections. Think of your memory as a phonographic record, and take care that you place the right kind of impressions upon it. In memory you reap that which you have sown. You must give to the memory before you can receive from it. Of one thing you may rest assured, namely, that unless you take sufficient interest in the things to be remembered, you will find that the memory does not take sufficient interest in them to remember them. Memory demands interest before it will take interest in the task. It demands attention before it will give attention. It demands understanding before it will give understanding. It demands association before it will respond to association. It demands repetition before it will repeat. The memory is a splendid instrument, but it stands on its dignity and asserts its rights. It belongs to the old dispensation. It demands compensation and believes in giving only in equal measure to what it receives. Our advice is to get acquainted with your memory and make friends with it. Treat it well, and it will serve you well, but neglect it, and it will turn its back on you. End of Chapter 8. End of Section 3.